The flames of the mill's furnace still crackled in the silent dawn of Georgia. The wood of the old barn, once worn and forgotten, now displayed something new. A name carved with almost sacred precision. Miss Eleanor. It was the name of the master's daughter, the woman no one touched, whom everyone revered in silence. A name etched by hand, by a slave. No one knew when he had done it, but everyone knew who the only one capable was. Isaiah, the man with silent hands and the eyes of an artist. Since boyhood, he had been called a shadow. He worked in the depths of the cotton plantation, where songs became laments and the sun never showed mercy. He had never been given a voice, yet his soul overflowed through the lines he left hidden in the corners of the shacks. Flowers, birds, faces no one remembered. And then that night, Isaiah dared more. He carved not a flower, nor a symbol, but a name. And it wasn't just any name. When the overseer found the inscription, time stopped. The torch shook in his hand. The wood still smoked. The air grew thick, as if the earth itself had witnessed an impossible crime. A slave marking the barn wall with the name of the plantation's heiress. Was it art? Was it a cry? Or was it love? On that plantation where chains weighed heavier than silences, that gesture became a lightning bolt in the dry sky of routine. Something no one dared to name, but everyone felt a rupture, a warning, a beginning. Because when Isaiah wrote Eleanor on that wall, he didn't just leave a mark on the world. He announced a story that, from that moment on, could never be erased. The sun rose like a whisper over the cotton fields of the Willow Creek plantation, casting a golden hue on the treetops and the dew still resting on the leaves. Georgia breathed a quiet heat, and the earth exhaled that bittersweet scent of damp morning and old sweat. The birds sang as if unaware of the weight of life below them. But those who lived in the slave quarters were already moving, not with freedom, but with the forced precision of those who had learned to survive inside the routine of suffering. Among them, there was one who didn't quite fit, not because he was better, stronger, or faster, but because, even in silence, he carried something in his eyes that no overseer could name. Isaiah. He was young, but his soul seemed as old as stone. His lean muscles, carved by labor, hid hands that knew how to sculpt, draw, create. There was something restless and deep within him, like an underground river no one could see, yet one that nourished everything around it. Son of a woman from Ghana, known for telling stories under the moonlight, and of a quiet man who disappeared too soon, Isaiah grew up among echoes. He never learned to read words, but he read the world with a sensitivity that unsettled those around him. Since childhood, he would scratch drawings into the dirt with sticks, mold small clay figures, carve shapes into tree bark using the edge of sharp stones. His art was a secret, hidden like a forbidden prayer. But there, at the back of the plantation, his markings told stories no one dared to speak. Faces of ancestors, wild animals, sacred symbols, and sometimes gazes. It was one of those gazes that connected him to her. Eleanor Bradford was the only daughter of Colonel William Bradford, owner of Willow Creek. Her hair was the color of scorched copper, and her skin rarely touched the sun. She had grown up among seamstresses, governesses, and expectations. Her mother, who died when she was only 9, was remembered as a fragile, dreamy woman. Perhaps that was why Eleanor carried an unrest in her chest that never quite belonged in the grand halls of the big house. She read in secret, books smuggled from South Carolina, hidden among bolts of fabric. She wrote poems on scraps of paper she kept in a silver box inherited from her mother. But most of all, she watched. From her second-floor window, she looked out at the world with hungry eyes. She watched the horses, the workers, the fields, the overseers, and among them all, her eyes always returned to him, to Isaiah. At first it was just curiosity. There was something different about that broad-shouldered young man with the quiet walk. He didn't rush, but he didn't seem weary either. It was as if he danced beneath the weight of life, even when chained to the same routine as everyone else. Eleanor saw him drawing for the first time on a lightly rainy afternoon. She was walking near the quarters when she found him kneeling, etching into the mud with a stick. She stopped, stood there, hidden behind a wooden pillar, and watched. He was drawing a bird, but not a common one. It had open wings made of leaves, human-like eyes, and a body curved as if ready to take flight. Eleanor held her breath. She had never seen anything so full of soul. Isaiah finished the drawing, looked at it for a moment, then wiped it away with his hand, as if he knew he was not allowed to leave marks. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She felt guilt, confusion, and a kind of silent fascination. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something earlier, a question with no name. In the following days, she began seeking him out more often. She never approached, just watched. Isaiah noticed. He felt her presence, as if the air thickened when she was near. But he didn't avert his gaze. He continued drawing, carving, creating little pieces meant for the wind. One afternoon, while the others rested beneath the trees, Isaiah lingered near the old barn. There was a piece of wood there, half loose from the structure, smooth, dry, almost like a blank canvas. He looked around. No one nearby. He picked up a thin stone and began to work. It wasn't a drawing. It was a name. Eleanor. Carefully, as if each letter were an offering. There was no anger, no desire, no defiance. There was reverence. His art was his only way of existing. And now, for the first time, he left a mark he wouldn't erase. A forbidden gesture, yes, but also inevitable. Because, without knowing how or why, Isaiah carried that name inside him. Back in the big house, Eleanor returned to her window. As always. But that day she missed him, didn't see him, and it disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. That night in her thoughts, she revisited the drawing of the bird. And unknowingly, she felt that something was about to change. Something already had. And on that piece of wood, hidden under the silent moonlight of Georgia, a story had begun to be written. The afternoon heat seemed to stretch time in Willow Creek. The air was thick, still, as if even the wind were afraid to move. The workers dragged their feet over the dry red earth, and the birds fell silent in the high trees, waiting for the day to finally end. It was one of those afternoons when everything felt suspended, and it was on one of those afternoons that the silence between Isaiah and Eleanor was broken, not with words but with a gesture. Isaiah was in the barn alone, scraping the edges of a warped piece of wood. He needed to repair the frame of a window the overseer kept breaking every time he lost his temper with the horses. It was a small task, but Isaiah always saw opportunity in the edges of the ordinary. In his hands, even tired wood regained elegance. He didn't know he was being watched. Eleanor had come down from the big house with a simple pretext, to bring a forgotten book to the back porch. The housekeeper was asleep, and her father had gone out on horseback with the overseers. It was rare to be alone. Even rarer to be alone and free. She walked barefoot through the damp grass, hidden by the orchard, and when she approached the barn, she stopped. Inside, she saw Isaiah's back. His shoulders moved with a rhythm almost musical, and his gestures were so focused that she became hypnotized. A snap of wood gave her away. Isaiah turned. Their eyes met again, like the first time, but now closer. She could have run, could have made up an excuse, pretended she was lost, or simply backed away in silence. But she didn't. Isaiah stood still. Neither fear nor defiance, just presence. Eleanor stepped inside. The smell of the barn was strong. Wood, sweat, horsehair, and a faint scent of lavender from her dress. The contrast between their two worlds met in that tight space full of memory. "You," she began, but her voice faltered. She gathered herself. "Are you the one who makes the carvings?" Isaiah didn't answer with words. He simply looked at the wood in his hands, then at the corner of the barn where, days earlier, he had carved the name. Her name. Eleanor followed his gaze. When she saw the inscription, her heart raced. It was what she suspected and feared. "Why did you do it?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Why my name?" Isaiah lowered his eyes. Seconds passed, maybe minutes, before he raised his face again. And then he spoke. For the first time, she heard his voice. "Because you looked at me like no one ever had." There was no sweetness in his tone, no pleading. It was a raw truth, offered as if it were inevitable. Eleanor felt a chill run up her spine. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper. You know what this means? She said, pointing at the wood. If they find out, they already know, Isaiah replied firmly. They just haven't acted yet. She took a deep breath, sat on one of the nearby barrels. For a moment, the two of them stayed there in silence. But it wasn't empty. It was the silence of two people recognizing in each other something the world had tried to erase. My father, she began, but didn't finish. Isaiah understood. He sees what he wants to see, and what he doesn't, he silences. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Eleanor lowered her eyes, touched the carved name with her fingers. You write well for someone who never had school, she said, almost with a smile. Isaiah answered without hesitation. I learned from scraps, bits of paper, torn pages. My mother told me letters were like spells. You could change the world with them. She looked at him, long, steady. She saw not a slave, not a laborer, but a man, a whole being made of pain, strength, and beauty. And why me? She insisted. Why not something else? Another name? Isaiah paused before answering. His gaze seemed to pass through the barn walls, back in time, reaching the exact moment when the inspiration came. Because you're trapped too, but still fighting. Eleanor swallowed hard. That hit deeper than she wanted, because it was true. I don't know what's happening, she said, confused. This, you and me, it shouldn't exist. But it does, he replied simply. She stood slowly, walked to the barn door, looked outside, then back at him. No one can know, she whispered. No one. Isaiah nodded. She turned to leave, but before crossing the threshold, she stopped. Will you keep writing? He gave a small shrug, a near smile. I never stopped. Eleanor walked away without looking back, but she felt something had stayed behind. Something began to grow that sweltering afternoon, like a root breaking through stone. Their meeting was not a climax. It was a beginning, fragile, hidden, but real. The Georgia heat was rising, but it wasn't just the weather weighing on Willow Creek. A restless silence was spreading across the plantation, as if something invisible were about to happen. The air felt heavier, and gazes lingered longer. Whispers filled the corridors of the slave quarters, the fields, the kitchen of the big house, and they all pointed to the same source, the name of the young mistress carved into the barn wall. It didn't take long for someone to carry the news to Colonel William Bradford. They didn't mention Isaiah's name. Not yet. They only whispered that a slave had the audacity to carve Miss Eleanor's name into the barnwood. At first, the colonel didn't believe it. He thought it was gossip or some kind of crude joke, but the doubt was already a seed, and it began to grow. The next morning, he went to the barn, accompanied by the overseer, Mr. Whitmore, a thin man with a bony face and a sharp voice. And there it was, the inscription, still intact. The letters were firm, deep, etched with a precision that left no doubt. It had been done with intention. It wasn't vandalism. It was art. Bring everyone from the quarters. Now, Bradford ordered, his voice deep like thunder. In less than an hour, more than 30 men and women stood in line under the burning sun, eyes lowered, breaths held tight. Isaiah among them. The colonel walked slowly past the rows, as if searching for guilt in the silence. He stopped in front of the group of younger workers, staring at each one, and then his eyes landed on Isaiah. Was it you? He asked without raising his voice. Isaiah didn't answer. The silence lasted seconds that felt like hours. When the colonel repeated the question, this time more firmly, Isaiah finally raised his eyes. It was me? There was no arrogance, no fear, just a simple dry statement, as if accepting a truth. A murmur ran through those present. Overseer Whitmore stepped forward, hand already reaching for his belt, but the colonel stopped him with emotion. Why? Isaiah took a deep breath. His eyes were calm yet unshaken. Because she saw my soul, before the world even knew I had one. The words struck like lightning. Bradford paled. It wasn't just boldness. It was a challenge to the entire structure of that place. A slave claiming the master's daughter had truly seen him. "Are you implying that—" the colonel began, but his voice failed him. He turned away, furious, and marched back to the big house. The sound of cicadas filled the night in Willow Creek, muffling any attempt at silence. The plantation, usually asleep by that hour, seemed wide awake. Inside the slave quarters, no one slept well. In the big house, footsteps were quiet, but the air was charged. A storm was brewing. Something was about to happen, and everyone could feel it. After what Eleanor had done, nothing felt safe anymore. Colonel William Bradford was not a man who forgot, nor one who forgave. He spent the following day locked in his office, with the bottle more present than reason. His pride was bleeding. A slave had defied his authority in front of everyone. But worse than that, his daughter had defied him too. And what made him even more silent and more furious was the fact that she showed no regret. Eleanor, on the other hand, walked the estate like someone who had already lost everything, and because of that, feared nothing. She didn't avoid stares. She didn't flee from whispers. But she didn't respond either. It was as if she carried within herself a certainty no one around her could understand. Isaiah kept working in the corners of the plantation. Overseer Whitmore made a point of watching him more closely, as if waiting for another mistake to justify a punishment. But Isaiah remained silent, a silence denser now, full of meaning. He was no longer invisible. He was watched, as visible as he was dangerous. Eleanor's name remained carved into the wood of the barn, and strangely, no one dared to erase it, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of respect. Or maybe somehow, everyone knew that name no longer belonged only to the master's daughter. It had become a symbol, a cry etched into the world for all to see. One sweltering afternoon, a stranger arrived at the plantation. He wore a crushed hat, dusty boots, and the arrogance of someone who thought everything could be bought. His name was Benjamin Carter, son of a wealthy neighboring landowner. He came to visit the colonel, but everyone knew the real reason. He intended to ask for Eleanor's hand in marriage. The conversation took place in the main parlor of the big house. Eleanor was called in, sat before the two men, and listened. Carter spoke of land, alliances, how uniting two powerful families would secure the region's future. He spoke of her as if she were currency. Eleanor, hands resting in her lap, listened in silence. And then, with a calm that froze the room, she said, "I don't belong to anyone." Bradford looked up, furious. Carter choked on his own arrogance. "Eleanor, you will apologize right now," the colonel said. She stood. "The only thing I regret is that anyone ever thought I was negotiable." And she walked out of the room, leaving both men in a mix of rage and shame. That night, the colonel erupted. He called for Whitmore and locked himself in the office with him for hours. No one heard what was said, but when the door opened, the order had been given. Isaiah was to be transferred, not punished, at least not officially. That was no longer possible after such a public scene, but he would be sold, removed, erased from the map, taken to another plantation in another state, far from Eleanor's eyes, far from any threat. 2 days later, Isaiah was summoned. No warning, no explanation. "You're leaving for Savannah in the morning," Whitmore said. "A buyer's waiting." The colonel already signed the papers. Isaiah listened but said nothing. He simply looked up at the sky as if searching for answers among the heavy clouds gathering on the horizon. That night, Eleanor learned the news from Clara, one of the oldest housemaids who had overheard the overseers talking. Eleanor's world collapsed. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply ran, barefoot, into the rain that had begun to fall. She ran to the barn. Isaiah was there, finishing cleaning the tools as if it were just another day. When he saw Eleanor, wet, trembling, eyes red, his chest tightened. "Is it true?" she asked. He nodded. "Tomorrow. They want to erase you, as if you were a mistake." "They can't erase what's already been seen," Isaiah said, his gaze steady. "They can take me, but they can't take what remains." Eleanor walked to him. Their hands touched for the first time, a light touch but whole. Their eyes met as if the entire universe were held in that single moment. "Tell me," she whispered. Did you feel it too? I did, he answered. From the first time you looked at me like I was a person, the rain intensified, pounding on the roof. The barn felt too small for so much feeling. I'll do something, she said. I won't let them take you like this. You already did, Isaiah replied. You said what no one ever dared to say. You gave me more than freedom. You gave me a name. And then, in the wet silence of that night, she embraced him. Not like a lady embracing a servant, but like one soul meeting another. And the world for 1 second stopped hurting. But morning would come, and with it the carriage, the farewell, and the moment to choose between accepting fate or facing it once and for all. Dawn arrived with a strange stillness over Willow Creek. The sky, still tinged with gray, seemed to hesitate between night and day, as if time itself sensed that this would not be just another morning. The plantation was silent. No birds sang. Even the animals seemed to feel what was coming. The carriage stood ready, parked in front of the barn. 2 armed men had come from Savannah to take Isaiah. They brought papers, orders, and the certainty that the job was done. To them, it was just another transfer. To Isaiah, it was the end of everything he had known, including her. He carried no belongings, only what was in his heart. He said goodbye to his mother with a long, firm embrace. Mary Beth didn't cry. She was made of an ancestral strength that didn't allow tears in front of overseers. But her eyes said everything. She knew she might never see her son again. But she also knew he wasn't leaving defeated. Isaiah left the same way he had lived, with dignity. While the men adjusted the harnesses on the horses, Eleanor came down the stairs of the big house. She wore a simple dress, her hair loose, feet bare. She looked freer than ever, and yet more conflicted. She knew this was her last chance. She walked to her father, who sat smoking silently on the porch, his eyes fixed on the dirt road. "You're going to let him leave," she said. The colonel didn't reply. "You're going to let him leave so everything can go back to how it was, so you can believe you won." "I don't need to win," he muttered without looking at her. "I just need to keep everything standing." "But what's standing, Father?" Eleanor asked. "A house that's already rotting inside? A plantation where no one respects anyone? You want to keep that alive? For what?" He looked at her for the first time and saw not the obedient girl, but a woman with fire in her eyes. And for a moment, he doubted his own convictions. "He is not your equal, Eleanor," he said coldly. "Then why has he taught me more than any book, any tutor, any man with a last name?" She fired back. "Why did he make me see who I really am?" The colonel hesitated, but his pride was old and his guilt older still. He turned his face away and gestured for the men to take Isaiah. Isaiah climbed into the carriage. Eleanor ran. She stopped by the door, her eyes fixed on his. "Wait for me," she said. "Wait. How?" he whispered. "In what world?" She touched his hand. "In the world that doesn't exist yet, but begins here." Isaiah didn't reply. He just looked into her eyes, long and deep, as if capturing that image forever inside him. The carriage left. Eleanor stood still, watching the dust rise along the road. Behind her, the servants watched in silence. The big house seemed smaller now, less imposing, less certain. Days passed. Eleanor refused food, ignored her father, and spent hours in the barn, staring at the wood where her name was still carved. Now she had carved another name beside it, Isaiah. That's where she made her decision. The next night, with the help of Clara and an old coachman named Amos, Eleanor left Willow Creek. She fled the house where she was raised, leaving behind dresses, jewelry, and promises. She took only a few books, her writings, and the hope of finding Isaiah. She traveled for 2 days across southern roads, asking discreet questions, following whispers. In each village, she asked, "Have you seen a tall man, dark-skinned, with eyes that draw the whole world just by looking?" Until she reached a smaller farm on the outskirts of Millen. There they said yes, that a new worker had arrived just days ago, that he stayed in the tool shed, that he moved in silence. But one night, he carved a bird into the bench in the yard, and no one dared sit there again. Eleanor ran. When she saw him, standing in the barn's shadow, clothes dirty, hands calloused, her heart raced. He saw her and didn't believe it. "You," he said, barely audible. "I came for what's mine," she said, smiling. "And I'm not talking about names or ownership or titles. I came for what changed me." He embraced her. No rush, no explanations. Just the recognition of two souls who had dared to cross worlds to find one another. They never returned to Willow Creek. They went north, to a place where hope was more than a dream, where they could begin something new. Eleanor began teaching black children to read, Isaiah to carve. Together they opened a small school in Asheville, where every beam, every stone, every letter on the sign carried a piece of their story. The sign read simply, "For those who dared to love." And carved into the wood in firm letters were two names, Eleanor and Isaiah. Time passed like the wind that sweeps across the fields in autumn. Silent, inevitable, transformative. Years had gone by since Eleanor and Isaiah left Willow Creek, and while the world kept turning through wars, changes, and broken promises, their names remained alive, even when no one dared to speak them aloud. In the small town of Asheville, among gentle hills and ancient trees, a simple wooden building had become the shelter of something grand. It wasn't a church, nor a traditional school, but a place of gathering, a refuge for stories. They called it the House of Letters. There, children who had never held a book learned to read. Young people who had only ever heard commands discovered the power of their own words. Women shared their memories. Men wounded by silence finally found a voice. And among them all, two names always returned in whispers and conversations, Eleanor and Isaiah. She taught with passion, eyes always attentive to what wasn't said. He carved benches, frames, signs, as if every piece of wood held a soul waiting to be freed. They didn't speak much about the past. They didn't need to. People felt it. There was peace in their movements, truth in every glance. Anyone who saw them together understood. Love doesn't need permission, only courage. Years later, in a particularly golden autumn, Eleanor passed on, peacefully, like a leaf that lets go at the right time. Isaiah stayed in the house for a while, quiet, but not empty. He carried everything they had lived inside her. And every day he sat beneath the same tree where she loved to read, not to mourn, but to remember. Shortly before she passed, Eleanor had left behind a notebook. In it were poems, unsent letters, and at the end, a single phrase. If our love survived where it was never meant to exist, then it is greater than time. Isaiah never wrote a book, but they said each of his sculptures was a living page of that story. He carved not with his hands, but with memory. In the children's eyes, in the lines of old faces, in the details of every petal and wrinkle, there lived a piece of Eleanor. Willow Creek fell into ruin. After the war, the plantation was abandoned, the big house reclaimed by time. But the barn stood longer, and in a hidden corner of an old beam, the names remained, still there. Eleanor, Isaiah. Years later, when a group of students visited the ruins, one of them, young, curious, black, found the carving. He took a photo. He researched. He uncovered the legend. He wrote an article. The article became a play, the play became a film, and the story was reborn. Not as a forbidden romance, but as a symbol that love, when true, endures time, pain, silence, and chains. It endures even history. Today, at the entrance of the new Asheville Library, where the House of Letters once stood, there is a wooden sculpture, two hands intertwined, one dark, one light. On the pedestal, the same phrase Eleanor once wrote in her notebook, "If our love survived where it was never meant to exist, then it is greater than time." And beside it, carved with care and permanence, two names the world tried to forget, but memory refused to erase, Eleanor and Isaiah. And you? Have you ever seen a love bloom where it was never supposed to exist, yet flourish against all odds? If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments. What moved you most in this journey? Eleanor's courage, Isaiah's dignity, or the strength of a feeling that even time could not erase? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, lived, and shared, Then spread this emotion. Send it to someone who values the power of love, art, and freedom. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that stirs the soul and sparks hope. Because here, every video is a reminder that even in the darkest past, there's always light where there is love.